What does Kevin Durant really want? How does he want to see this whole thing with the Nets play out? Can we even know? Have we learned enough from the situation to have a feel for what he wants? Is it very specific to one team? Is it just regarding the Nets? Is it just regarding one or two people? It's a very odd situation, one that probably is not going to be cleared up really anytime soon, but we've learned a lot about it. Let's figure out what it is that Kevin Durant wants. We'll talk about that. But first, the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo.
All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Doug Norrie, the owner and operator of Daily Fantasy Sports Rankings. That's a mouthful, so just type in dfsr.com if you need projections, FanDuel and or DraftKings, covering you through MLB season, obviously NFL right around the corner, NBA. We'll be here before you know it, so go check out DFSR. Over there is not Adam Armbrecht today. He's the host of the One Giant podcast. He is going to be away from the mic for the next couple of days. Hopefully, we'll have some other folks in here filling in. That's all right, Adam. Get the rest, buddy. Do what you need to do. Adam will be holding it down next week as we sort of trade off some pieces of the summertime during the offseason. Though for the Nets, the offseason never really seems to start. And this kind of has felt like the marching orders, the talking points over the last couple of years. And this season's just dialed up to the absolute nth degree with, you wouldn't even know really we were in the off season here with the amount of news that just continues to come on the Kevin Durant front or the speculation that comes around the Kevin Durant front. And then by, extension, there's Kyrie Irving talk because, whatever happens with Kevin Durant here, there will be a number of different dominoes that begin falling. That's what dominoes do. They fall. Whatever happens with him in the trade, whether he were to stay and others were to go, that's looking not exactly likely. Whether they make amends, that doesn't appear to be likely either. But the Nets remain in this holding pattern because of what the team can or can't do around the Kevin Durant situation. More stuff came out last week about Durant, maybe expanding the number of teams that he would be willing to go to. We did not podcast near the end of the week to talk about the Philly thing, but I will address that in this episode, probably a little closer to the end of the episode. But we're kind of left with this situation where it's like, what does Kevin Durant want? Now, look, asking what any other person, really, regardless of who they are, whether they're a celebrity or not, specifically around what NBA basketball players or superstars want, is usually a foolhardy errand, right? We can't really put ourselves into the headspace or the mind space, or it's definitely not like the physical attribute space of players in the NBA, and trying to compare them to our own lives or the situations that they're in is usually just not a good idea, because you're not going to come up with answers that are of the realistic variety. Okay. We can't put with our own job, we can't put ourselves in Kevin Durant's shoes around what we would do. That's silly. And don't try to do that, please. It doesn't make any sense. So once you get past that, you start to wonder, well, what is it like? What's the end game here? Does he just want out? Like, is it out? Don't care where I land? Is it out? I want to go to a specific team. Is it I just want these two guys like Nash or Marks fired, or I just want one of them fired? Like, we're in such a weird situation with Kevin Durant, unlike many other situations we've seen in the superstar realm before, because it does feel like every day the information kind of just changes here, or it's harder to put your finger on what exactly the end game is here, what exactly the wants and desires are. When we first started, it was Kevin Durant wants to be traded, would prefer to go to Phoenix. Okay, that's the landing spot, right? That's where we start. At the time, there's some maneuvers that could have maybe been made around Ayton and stuff like that would have made that situation feel sort of viable at the beginning, if not totally in practice. And then when Ayton resigns, it doesn't really feel all that realistic with just one team, a 1-to-1 swap for the Suns. So when you start, you're like, okay, well, he wants out, but and he wants to go to Phoenix. He wants to play with Chris Paul. Like he wants to, and he's got maybe a few other listed teams, Miami, that he would want to go to. They have to be in championship contention. And that's kind of it. And then, but then when you start thinking about that, it looks, around Phoenix, it doesn't look realistic, right? It doesn't look realistic to make a package, a 1-for-1 package happening with those two teams because they just don't have the requisite assets, and that's fine, but that's where we are. So then, okay, so he just wants to be away from, he doesn't want to just go to the Suns. He just wants to be on a list of other teams. And some of those other teams aren't that realistic either, like the Miami package, a package around Tyler Hero. I don't think that's that realistic. And they don't have tons and tons of assets to be able to give. They have picks, but in terms of players coming back, if Hero's the best player, I mean, is that really what you want? So if you're from Durant's headspace, thinking realistically about it, I mean, even like sort of a lay fan would know that those two things aren't so realistic out of the gate, right? But as we've gone on with this thing, it's becoming less and less clear about what it is Kevin Durant wants, unless the thing is just, I just want to be anywhere else but the Nets. That's the one that's starting to look like the realistic one, because as more news comes out, it does feel like the information we're getting more just points to the idea of, I want to sow discord and I want to be out of here. Whether the sowing the discord was a part of the original plan is like not totally clear. I mean, that's definitely where we are now. Maybe because he felt like there was a situation that it wasn't moving at the pace he wanted to be. It didn't seem like there was anything really happening. The Nets were being unrealistic about in his mind, of what they wanted in return for him. Because as the days and weeks go on, man, it just doesn't seem to be getting any clearer about what he wants. And highlighted by the supposed meeting with Joe Tsai. When it comes out of the meeting with Tsai, where he basically through shams reports that it's either him or like the partnership of Nash and Marks, whichever way you want to kind of slice that, they need to go, leaving the door sort of open that it's those guys. It's not necessarily that I want to be off the Nets. It's those guys. Do we believe that to be really the case? It's hard to really trust that. It's hard to really trust that as an actual want from him. More that always, or has seemed like more of a negotiating standpoint around the trade, like pushing the buttons here, right? Applying pressure, making it so that, there's knowing that Joe Tsai would never choose Kevin Durant over Sean Marks or Steve Nash. Like a move like that would make it seem like he just wants out no matter what. And I think that's where we're getting to, but I don't know if it ends up making the situation any more clear for the Nets, because it doesn't feel like the number of teams has even expanded that much, even if that were the case. We've seen I guess that's not true. We've seen the Celtics get into the mix, obviously. There was the mention of the Sixers as being thrown out there over the course of last week. Whether that feels realistic or not, I mean, I'll just cut it. It doesn't feel realistic, but that's where we are. We've mentioned Toronto. We've mentioned the Pelicans. Those are kind of just teams that had the requisite seeming assets to be able to line up a trade, and then the Heat and the Suns. So I guess as the number of teams grows, whether it's by Kevin Durant's own admission or how we look at it, it does feel, with everything that's happened, I do feel like we're getting to the point of just being able to say Kevin Durant just wants out no matter what. It doesn't matter who's in the front office. It doesn't matter who's the coach. It doesn't matter who what players they're going to add or not add. It doesn't matter what the team looks like right now. Kevin Durant wants out, and that's what we're left with. And so when that's the case, it's hard to know if that makes the situation better or worse. It doesn't feel like it's getting better. It should feel like we can at least reach something like an endpoint. But man, the way it's going right now, it remains very difficult to get a handle on what you think is going to happen. I got a ton more to talk about here. I want to talk about Durant's contract situation, which came up over the course of specifically the payouts around the contract came up late last week. Want to quickly discuss this Sixer thing. Also want to talk about like sort of the organizational choice that the Nets, I think, should at least consider when it comes to Kevin Durant. Going to get all to that in a second. First, going to tell you about our friends over at Built Bar. If you haven't tried the Built Bar Puffs, you're depriving yourself of one of life's great joys. and they have that new flavor we've been talking about, cookie dough. If you're a cookie dough fan, whether it's like an ice cream flavor or just the actual stuff, the Built Bar Puff are going to absolutely pay off around this. They got the chunk puffs. They had the little pieces of cookie dough, which are kind of a prerequisite when you're talking about this flavor, and they're actually healthy for you. Only 160 calories. 15 grams of protein. You can go to built.com and snag a box for you. The family's going to be jumping on it as well. It's the perfect treat. Make sure maybe set some aside for yourself, because these things, as I know around our family, these things tend to go quick. Like I said, they got all the stats to back it up on the health piece. They've been devoted to the flavors for a while, and that's what makes you keep going back to Built Bar. Go to built.com. Use the promo code LOCKEDON15. You're going to get 15% off of your order. Use promo code LOCKEDON15 for 15% off at built.com. All right. The other thing that came up last week was regarding the Kevin Durant contract situation, meaning that some people could say, hey, what does Kevin Durant want? Like, Kevin Durant just wants to get paid. And it was reported by Mark Stein originally and been picked up by a number of different other outlets that Durant, the day after he requested the trade from the Brooklyn Nets over the summer, around the time the free agency was hitting, was when the first installment of his contract for this season was due, meaning that essentially the Nets were going to pay Kevin Durant right on the heels of him asking out from the team. And I get why that feels a little bit weird to people. And I totally understand why it would sort of be spun in the way that it was spun. It was like, oh, hey, you have no problem, hammering a check from somebody, even though you don't want to be there anymore. And that's how this originally comes off looking, is like, okay, well, you're under contract for $42 million, $44 million this year. Your first installment of that was in the 10 million plus range right away, like on July 1st. And then the next installment is due on October 1st, which is prior to the season starting. And so you're like, okay, well, you're going to take the money, but you have no problem cashing the check from the Nets, but you also, while you ask out from the team. And I get why that's a really easy way for basically every outlet to spin it, in terms of making Durant look kind of bad in that respect, right? Like, does he look great taking the money from the Nets, with the signature of the Nets on the check, Joe Tsai's signature, whoever those things are. I mean, I'm sure just, deposit into the account, but just to give a visual around it. Does it make sense for him to take that money while also at the same time asking out for the team? And so I get why, that doesn't look great. I get why someone would say, oh, this looks pretty bad. At the same time, this is just kind of how the league works. I mean, no one's going to turn the money down. Players ask for trades all the time. This is they're most times getting paid throughout the whole process. This is not, I felt like on that reporting, the timing really was more instructive than like the actual thing being bad. Was Kevin Durant ever going to just refuse to get paid by the Nets because he wanted a trade? No, of course not. Like, as of right now, he's still under contract for the team. We don't know if he plans on sitting out and making things weird at the beginning of the season. Definitely the tenor around that will change once the season starts. If he's not playing and has gotten paid during that time and refuses to play, whether the Nets can institute fines against him. It's difficult if they've already prepaid the money, right? So fining him a la the Ben Simmons situation last year, where the Sixers basically just withheld the pay. And that case is in arbitration right now about what's going to happen, because obviously Simmons has an account of that's different than the Sixers, and they're going to, argue about what's going to happen. And I will say too, whatever happens with that Simmons case will, I think, have ramifications throughout the league in terms of how these situations are dealt with going forward. Whether or not teams are going to want to stick to not paying a guy if they don't come, or how long, or how kind of nasty trade demand can get over a period of time. Because really, when it comes down to the money, that's where people are going to get the most upset. They're going to get the most roiled up. I totally understand that. And that's why the Durant thing plays so interestingly, because It's like, oh, you're going to ask for a trade and then take the money. Oh, the season's going to start. You're going to have no problem having taken the money, but then possibly sit out. I would say let's pause on that until the actual season starts, whether we get our, our haunches up. Like if we start getting real, tense about whether Kevin Durant should have taken the money or not, everyone would have taken the money. Like, no doubt. There's no way. The union would have told you to take it. Like, even if they wanted to take it, even if they wanted to give it back, which, by the way, nobody does, because like, look to yourself. Are you turning down money that's coming to you, even though your situation might not be perfect? No, we can stop that, please. Like, no one's going to be doing that. So everyone can just kind of rest easy on that one. Even if they wanted to say, hey, I'm going to give all the money back I want out of this contract, there's no chance the union would have ever allowed that to happen. They do not want no part of the NBA Players Association wants any part with a player giving money back or refusing money when they're still under contract and able to play. There's no chance. It will set a precedent that they never want to have to try to walk back or walk away from. So even if Durant had gone and said, oh, this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to, refuse the money, don't pay me, and we'll figure out how this situation works out. No way. There's no way. No one would have ever done it. So I think the part where folks get sort of annoyed by that, or it looks bad, or it's just not what should have been done, or it's not a stand-up thing to do. I do think that's a little overblown and sort of a little silly, because there's just too many things standing in the way of any real sort of situation happening with this, any like real outcome that would have made people feel better. Because like I said, even if you wanted to turn it down and say, don't pay me till we figure it out, too many people would have told him not to do that. And so that was just never a realistic outcome to begin with. And when the contract was signed originally, those were the terms of the contract, those were the dates, and that's just the way it is. So coming up with a story like it looks super greedy or it looks really bad for Durant to take that money, I just think it actually misses a lot of the context behind why and how that came to be in the first place. So I just don't really, I can't really entertain that as like a realistic talking point. Again, I totally get it. I get why that's a great headline. I get why Stein would put it out there. That's good reporting to put it out there. You should put it out there. Like, that's useful information for how the mechanics of the team is working and how the payroll of the team is working, and like what are some of the other things that are on the table when it comes to Kevin Durant, for sure. Like that, we should know that information. But where we use it against Durant, and this isn't even me standing for Durant here. Like I'm just saying that I would say this for any player, whether I'm a fan of all the players. Like, no, really, most players don't bother me here. But like, regardless, even if they did, I wouldn't ever use this against them as a talking point for why it makes them look worse, or it makes them look greedy, or like he's doing wrong by the team. That's just not really the case. And so when it comes to what Kevin Durant wants, like, yeah, of course he wants to get paid. He's made enough money many times over. So like, I don't think it's even that, but you sign the contract, you want your $44 million. I would want it too. And so would everybody else. Well, I don't think money is driving it. Making it look like money is driving this is also not correct. And it's just not the way things work. And I just worry sometimes that folks kind of hone in on something like that a little too closely, use it as another sort of feather in their cap, or use it as just another checkbox to say why Durant has done all these things wrong, when that's just not really relevant to this. I don't think it really becomes part of the overall situation. I'd love to hear from people on this one too. Maybe I'm wrong about this one, right? Maybe it does speak to a greater NBA problem. It does speak to a greater sort of like player empowerment problem that the Nets, not the Nets, that the NBA in general has. I think the word NBA, the player empowerment piece is kind of overblown too. Like, player empowerment really only refers to a few players in the league. Like, player empowerment has essentially come down to, like, if you're in the top 20 of the league and you do something, then player empowerment kind of creeps up. Like, we don't reference player empowerment when it comes to really anybody else in the league, except for a very few stars in that very upper echelon of stars, of which Durant is one of them. And, when he wants out from your team, it's a ground shifting moment for the NBA landscape. So it's right to use player empowerment, but sometimes player empowerment is made to be felt like it's the entire league that's working into this player empowerment strategy, but it's just not the case. Think about who we've always referenced it to. LeBron, KD, Davis, Anthony Davis, and there's some Harden, there's some other ones, but they were all like in the top 10 of players in the league when it happened. When it's anybody else, we don't really think too much about it. And even to the point where getting a little lower down the rung, some players have chosen not to go this route because of maybe how it's going to look. Like Dame never went this route. Mitchell has been tight-lipped right now about what he wants for, in terms of the Jazz. So I would hesitate to kind of get too much into the player empowerment thing. And especially around this piece around the money. Like I said, I don't think this is a huge talking point that deserves us like really diving into what it means or what it means for Durant as a person. All right, let's close this thing off. Talk a little bit of Sixers here. I know it got thrown out there last week that, the Sixers could have interest or Durant might expand his list of teams to wanting to be teaming up with Harden again. I felt like, look, I know it went out there. It seems almost more funny than anything else. Like it's almost like a troll move on the part of the NBA sort of media landscape or just people within these camps to start discussing about Harden and Durant possibly teaming back up in some form or fashion on the Sixers, like whether the Sixers would have enough to even, put him on the list of guys that they could reasonably trade for. I just think it's more funny than anything else. I think that's actually why you didn't see it get tons of legs. It got a little bit toward the end of the week, but then it was kind of dismissed. Like, do the Sixers realistically have a package that the Nets would even begin to entertain? Forget about all the other stuff, by the way. Like, forget about the Simmons Harden trade. Forget about that it's in the East. Forget about that it's a competitor. Forget all that stuff, which I don't think would sway the Nets too much in a decision like this. But like, do the Sixers even have close to the realistic pieces to get Durant? Like, is a trade around Tyrese Maxey enough to move the needle for the Nets? I really don't think it is. And I did think this was more along the what Kevin Durant wants spectrum. This felt a lot more just kind of like trolly. Let's get people riled up. Let's like I said before, sow some discord. Let's apply some pressure to the Nets to get things moving in one direction. It really felt more like that. Look, if something actually comes from it, we'll talk about it for sure. I just really don't see it as being on the list of realistic outcomes for when it comes to what's going to happen with Durant here. I don't think there's enough in place. I don't think, again, I really don't think that the way the Nets operate, that they would ever really care who they traded a guy to. Like, I just don't think they think like that much. I think that's a correct way to think. I think you should not really worry. There's so few teams in the league that if someone that you're going to be a direct rival with has a package that's worth trading for, it shouldn't bother you that they're in the East or like they're in your division. Or you're going to play them a bunch of times. Like, there's just not enough teams. There's not enough teams in the league to start moving your decision that way. So I don't think that really becomes too much a part of it. I do think that, could they have, talked to a team? Could they have talked a little bit about this? Sure. But I just don't think it's going to get that much movement. I don't think this is something that builds a lot of traction. So I wanted to mention that too. One more thing I want to mention here on the way out, and maybe it's for a bigger discussion. Maybe we'll spend more of this podcast talking about this. It's something that Adam and I talked a decent amount about just through text over the course of last week. We couldn't jump on the podcast near the end, but it was something that would have played in podcast form. I'll give you like a few of the beats on this because I do think it's worth exploring, hearing some opinion about. I do think there should be a little bit more of a discussion around if what Kevin Durant actually wanted was to leave the Nets, whether what he actually wanted was it was him or it's Marks and Nash. Like, if there was a conversation like, hey, I'll stay, but those two guys got to go. I know people want to dismiss that outright as ridiculous. And I don't think it's not likely to happen that way. I think most organizations, just from the optics standpoint, would choose. I do think it's like a closer decision than some people would have you believe around whether the teams should choose the player or the front office personnel. I tweeted this out there recently and it got a decent amount of traction. So I wanted to throw it out here as well about if you just look at value over replacement level, like how easy is it to replace a Kevin Durant versus how easy it is to replace a Sean Marks or a Steve Nash. It's really like at that point, you should stop the discussion because it's nearly impossible to find a new Kevin Durant. It's very possible to find another GM and another coach. That's numbers. That's not a hot take. That's not me saying anything controversial. There's fewer Kevin Durant type athletes in the world than there are guys who can run teams. I'm not saying running a team is easy. I'm not saying being a coach is easy. It's really hard. You have to have a ton of skills. You have to have a ton of skills to be really good at it. I get that. I'm just saying strictly around the player pool, around players that are available that can replace Kevin Durant, or people that are available that can realistically replace most of what a GM does and most of what a coach does. At that point, it actually is not all that close. You would choose Durant every time if you were just basing it on that. If you were just basing it on value over replacement, it's not close. It's you choose Durant every time. There are problems with this, right? Like, what does it mean for the next guy? Do you want to turn all the control over from your team over to a single player? Like, what if you do that and then he wants out a year later? Like, there's a lot of really relevant questions after that. But I think sometimes we start the conversation in the wrong place. The conversation gets started in the wrong place where, a player wants out, it's choosing him or me. Now, we haven't had tons of examples of this, so maybe this is relatively new and we haven't had to speak about it that much, and that's why it feels weird. But strictly about whether or not you can get back the same sort of talent back, or you choose the coach or the GM, dude, it's not close. It's not close. But there's other considerations. But I do want to just have people think about that a little bit. Think about why we start the conversation in a different way. If basketball is about winning, and NBA basketball is about winning championships, who gives you a better chance to win a championship? Kevin Durant or the guy who signs the players like Kevin Durant onto the team? In the immediate, it's Kevin Durant. Long term, it's probably the GM if they're going to be able to make different moves. But all those moves are going to be around getting players like Kevin Durant onto the team. I know some fans want to just root for, they want to have a stable organization. They want to have a guy they can root for, a team they feel like they can root for. It feels good to them to have certain kinds of players on their team, like they're bought in, there's culture, all this other stuff. I get that part of it. And that's a realistic thing from a fan perspective. I'm not just stepping all over that and throwing it away. I get it. I understand why those things end up being important. I just think sometimes, especially around this, the conversation's a bit skewed, thinking about what the obvious choices. Oh, it's Durant or Marks. Oh, obviously we should choose Marks because that's what a team does. I don't know if it's that obvious. I don't think it's that obvious. I think if you strictly look at what I said before about who you can replace easier for an organization or for a team, you wouldn't even hesitate about it. It's not close. It's not close. There are other stuff. There are other things that go along with it. There are other ways it can look. There's the optics around. There's all this other stuff. There's people that just don't want players to have this much power. People don't want the player empowerment area. They don't like the way it feels. They don't like the way it looks. I get it. They don't want to root for it. Doing it the way I just suggested would be essentially rooting for that. But I will have you just say, think about it. Think about it a little bit. Think about what it is you want to watch on your basketball team. Do you want to watch teams that can try to win the championship? You need guys like this to do it. Do you just want a rooting interest because you like the team? You like its scrappy guys. You want them to exceed expectations. You want them to be a little bit better than you thought they were going to be. You want them to be happy. Things like, or what your version of what you think an athlete is happy. You don't know these people personally, but you want to think they're happy. If that's what you want, you're not going to like that answer that much. But I can see it when we talk about what Kevin Durant wants. I can see the case for saying, hey, if it's actually this, if it's actually these two guys or me, maybe the Nets should think about giving Kevin Durant what he wants in that case. We are going to be back this week, hoping to have some guests on this week to talk more about this offseason. We'll know a little bit more about that over the next day or two. Like I said, Adam off this week. We'll be holding it down solo. In the meantime, make sure you are subscribing to the Locked On Nets YouTube channel. Make sure you're hitting subscribe wherever you listen to the podcast. Totally free ways to help the show. Very easy for you to do, and they help us the most. So make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe over wherever you listen to podcasts. Adam is the one with the quotes from the great American poets. Like I said before, I always get to this point of the show, and remember, I take Adam for granted here because he's always got one lined up, and I never think about it until I hit this moment in the podcast. So assume that you heard something from one of the great American poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.